I am Alara Voss, 52 years old, and on the morning my husband's will was read, the world had already decided I was finished. The morning arrived dressed in quiet judgment. Not the loud, confrontational kind, but the subtler kind that settles into corners and clings to walls. The kind that forms in rooms where people pretend neutrality while silently placing bets. Whitmore and Hale Chambers carried that atmosphere well. The law office smelled of polished oak, old leather, and restrained ambition. This was a place where wealth was handled delicately, like fragile glass, and emotions were expected to remain outside. I arrived after Serena Blake did. She had planned it that way. Serena always arrived first when she wanted to be seen. She wore black, but not the kind meant for mourning. Hers was tailored, sharp, expensive. It clung to her body like a declaration. Her heels echoed against the marble floor with deliberate precision as she walked in, chin lifted, lips curved in a smile she didn't bother hiding. This was not grief. This was arrival. She chose the front seat without asking, crossing her legs slowly, confidently, as if the room already belonged to her. And everyone noticed. The distant relatives, the business associates, the curious observers who had no right to be there but found a way anyway. Whispers began almost immediately. Everyone knew who Serena was. Everyone knew why she was there. And everyone assumed the same thing. She had won. I entered quietly. No dramatic pause. No announcement. Just a soft opening of the door and measured steps forward. I wore plain black, simple and unadorned. No jewelry except my wedding band, which still rested on my finger despite everything that had happened. My shoes made almost no sound as I walked, and I didn't look around to meet anyone's gaze. I took a seat near the back. I placed my handbag neatly on my lap and folded my hands on top of it. There was no trembling, no sigh, no tears. To anyone watching, I probably looked detached, maybe even broken. A woman who had already lost everything. A woman who had come only to witness the final stamp on her humiliation. I could feel the assumptions settle around me like dust. Some people pitied me. Others dismissed me entirely. No one wondered what I knew. The lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, hadn't entered yet, but the room was already buzzing with conclusions. Serena leaned back in her chair and glanced over her shoulder once. Her eyes landed on me briefly. The look she gave me wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was indulgent. The look of someone convinced the fight had ended before it ever truly began. I met her gaze calmly, then looked away. Not in fear. Not in shame. But in restraint. What no one in that room understood, not yet, was that this moment was not the beginning of my ending. It was the final step of a journey I had already survived. Before Serena Blake. Before the mansion. Before the boardrooms and tailored suits. There was Caleb Voss and me. We married young, back when dreams were louder than money and ambition still carried the weight of fear. We lived in a rented apartment in Ravensshire with flickering lights and unreliable heating. I remember the sound of the pipes rattling at night, the way the walls seemed too thin to hold our hopes. Caleb came home exhausted most evenings. Rejection letters folded in his jacket pocket. Failed deals clinging to him like shadows. I learned to read disappointment in the slope of his shoulders before he ever spoke. I cooked meals that stretched too thin. Encouraged him when no one else did. Defended him when his own family questioned his direction. I worked whenever I could. Saved when it hurt. Believed when belief cost me comfort. Those years shaped me. They taught me endurance. They taught me silence. They taught me how to stand without applause. As Caleb's success grew, something else grew alongside it. Distance. Gratitude faded first, replaced by entitlement. Then came impatience. Criticism. The slow erosion of intimacy. I noticed the changes long before I ever suspected another woman. Late nights turned colder. Conversations shortened. My presence became inconvenient rather than grounding. Still I stayed. Not because I was weak, but because marriage, to me, was not a performance. It was a covenant. When I finally discovered Serena, it wasn't through a dramatic confrontation. It came through disrespect. Perfume lingering too long. A name mentioned too casually. A confidence that did not belong to someone passing through. When I confronted Caleb, he didn't deny it. He justified it. Minimized it. Diminished me. The day he asked me to leave the house was the day the world quietly decided I had lost. He framed it as temporary. Necessary. Something that would settle things. I packed without argument. No screaming. No crying. No threats. I simply left. That confused everyone. Including Caleb. What he never understood was something I learned long before Serena entered our lives. Sometimes survival requires retreat, not surrender. To Serena Blake, Caleb Voss was not a man with a past. He was a prize. She met him at a charity gala where champagne flowed freely and truth was optional. He was charming, powerful, attentive in a way that made her feel chosen. He spoke of his marriage like an obligation long expired, a story already finished. She believed him because believing him benefited her. At first, she enjoyed the secrecy, mistook discretion for devotion. When gifts arrived, trips, jewelry, promises, she interpreted them as investment. She told herself she wasn't stealing a life. She was upgrading it. Over time, Serena grew bold. Margaret, no, Alara, ceased to exist in her mind as a person. I became an obstacle. She corrected staff, hosted gatherings, rearranged spaces that were never hers. When Caleb fell ill, she stayed close. Not out of fear of losing him, but certainty of reward. Loyalty to Serena was proximity. Love was possession. Legacy never crossed her mind. The night I left the house, there were no slammed doors. That was what made it unforgettable. I packed slowly, folding clothes I had bought for a life that no longer wanted me. Caleb watched from the doorway, arms crossed. He expected tears. I gave him silence. I paused once in the bedroom we had shared for decades. Looked at the bed where promises once lived. Then I turned away. That silence followed him longer than any accusation ever could. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from, because stories like this are not just about endings, they're about survival. I rebuilt quietly. A modest apartment. Old routines. New boundaries. There were nights I cried. But there were mornings I woke up without fear. No longer waiting. No longer wondering. No longer shrinking. And while the world assumed I had disappeared, I was becoming something else entirely. Unbreakable. The months after I left the house unfolded quietly, almost invisibly. That was the strange thing about absence. When it doesn't announce itself, people assume nothing has changed. Caleb assumed that. So did Serena. They filled the silence I left behind with noise, activity, and assumption. They mistook quiet for erasure. Caleb convinced himself my departure was temporary. A pause. A sulk. Something that would resolve itself once emotions cooled. He replaced reflection with distraction, inviting Serena deeper into the spaces I once occupied without ceremony. She brought laughter that echoed too loudly in rooms meant for rest. She rearranged furniture, replaced curtains, introduced colors where I had preferred calm. She moved through the house as if it had been waiting for her all along. And Caleb let her. It required less thought to believe I had faded than to admit he had erased me. When he spoke of me at all, it was with irritation rather than guilt. He called me stubborn, old-fashioned, difficult. He never asked where I went, never asked how I survived. He assumed survival was not something I was capable of without him. I did not correct that assumption. While Serena claimed territory, I learned how to live without defending my existence. I rented a small apartment on the east side of Ravensshire, modest and quiet. I returned to routines I had abandoned for Caleb's ambitions. I cooked when I wanted to, slept when I needed to, spoke only when my words were welcome. The silence that once punished me began to protect me. There were nights grief arrived uninvited. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a heaviness that settled in my chest when memories surfaced without warning. But there were mornings too, mornings where I woke without fear. No footsteps to anticipate. No moods to manage. No explanations owed. I did not plot revenge. I did not dream of exposure. I simply lived. What I didn't know, what no one knew, was that Caleb was watching from a distance. Not openly. Not bravely. But enough to notice something he hadn't expected. I wasn't unraveling. I wasn't begging. I wasn't returning. Slowly, painfully, he began to realize that when I left, I took something with me that could never be replaced. Peace. His illness arrived without drama. At first, it was just fatigue that refused to leave. He dismissed it, pushed through meetings, masked weakness with authority. Serena hovered anxiously, managing appointments, controlling access, speaking for him even when he hadn't asked her to. To outsiders, she looked devoted. To him, she felt efficient. That distinction unsettled him. Doctors eventually spoke words he could no longer ignore. Words that narrowed the future and sharpened memory. Mortality has a way of rearranging priorities without asking permission. During long nights when sleep refused to come, Caleb thought of me. Not as an absence, but as a presence he had deliberately pushed away. He replayed moments he had never allowed himself to examine. Me sitting quietly while he spoke over me. Me standing beside him while others praised him. Me leaving without a fight. For the first time, he wondered what strength it had taken not to beg. Serena slept beside him during those nights. But it was my face that haunted him. Not angry. Not broken. Just resolved. He realized too late that love which demands nothing is often mistaken for weakness by those who only recognize noise. The decision to rewrite his will did not come with grand declarations. There was no speech. No announcement. Just a phone call placed with unsteady hands. Mr. Whitmore arrived at the hospital on a gray afternoon. Not as a lawyer attending a powerful client, but as a witness to a man afraid of being remembered incorrectly. Caleb looked smaller then. Not physically diminished so much as emotionally exposed. He spoke slowly. Paused often. As if each sentence required courage he had not practiced in years. He didn't ask how people would react. He didn't ask whether his choices would be challenged. He spoke of memory. Of how he feared being remembered as a man who mistook desire for devotion and applause for loyalty. He insisted the will be precise. Unambiguous. Immune to interpretation. No room for theatrics. No room for manipulation. What he wanted was finality. He dictated a letter as Mr. Whitmore took notes carefully. Every word chosen with intention. His voice cracked only once when he said my name. He didn't praise me loudly. Didn't dramatize my sacrifices. He stated facts. I stayed when there was nothing to gain. I left when staying would have destroyed me. I never asked to be repaid. That, he said, was loyalty in its purest form. When he spoke of Serena, his tone did not carry anger. It carried restraint. He acknowledged her presence, her companionship, her role in easing loneliness. But he refused to confuse comfort with commitment. That distinction mattered. When the documents were signed, Caleb leaned back against the pillow, exhausted. For the first time in months, he did not reach for Serena's hand. He didn't ask who was waiting outside. He closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to rest. He died weeks later, leaving behind a storm he would never have to face. The days after his death revealed grief in two forms. Serena's grief was public. Dramatic. Carefully staged. She cried loudly at the funeral. Clung to sympathetic arms. Spoke of love lost with rehearsed anguish. She wore black that emphasized sorrow without sacrificing beauty. She accepted condolences as confirmation of her place in Caleb's life. She moved fully into the house, issuing instructions, asserting authority, behaving not as a guest but as a successor. She spoke often of what Caleb wanted, even when no one asked. In her mind, the future had already arrived. My grief unfolded in private. There were no speeches, no witnesses, no performance. I mourned the man Caleb had once been, not the man he became. I mourned the partnership that ended without closure, the years that could not be reclaimed. Yet grief did not collapse me. It grounded me. When the invitation to the will reading arrived, I read it once, folded it neatly, placed it beside my bed. I did not anticipate justice. I did not expect surprise. I prepared only to witness an ending I believed had already been written. Serena prepared for confirmation. She spoke openly about handling the estate, about the future they planned, about stepping into her rightful place. No one corrected her. Silence felt like agreement. She never asked about the will. She didn't need to. Certainty is dangerous when it is built on assumption. The morning of the reading arrived with deceptive calm. Ravensshire moved as it always did, indifferent to the reckoning unfolding behind closed doors. Serena dressed with purpose. Confidence over restraint. Elegance over humility. She rehearsed expressions in the mirror. Not joy. Not greed. Solemn gratitude. She wanted to look deserving. I dressed simply. Not out of modesty, but instinct. I wasn't attending to receive anything. I was attending to close a chapter. When we arrived at Whitmore and Hale Chambers, the contrast was unmistakable. Serena claimed the front. I chose the back. Observers made silent judgments. Aligning posture with power. Volume with victory. No one noticed how still I was. No one questioned why I looked unafraid. And no one imagined that within minutes, everything they believed about loyalty, inheritance, and victory would collapse. When Mr. Whitmore entered, conversation died instantly. He carried a slim folder. Deceptively ordinary for something capable of dismantling lives. Formalities came first. Dates. Legal confirmations. Then assets. Properties. Portfolios. Figures that made people shift in their seats. With each item, Serena's confidence deepened. She nodded subtly. The room followed her lead. I listened without reaction. To me, those numbers were not prizes. They were echoes. Evidence of years lived unseen. Then Mr. Whitmore paused. The pause fractured certainty like glass. He removed a sealed letter and began to read. Caleb's words filled the room. Calm. Clear. Unavoidable. When he named me, not as a victim, but as a woman of endurance, the room shifted. Whispers rippled. Serena's posture stiffened. This was not the story she rehearsed. And it was only the beginning. The room had not yet recovered from the letter when Mr. Whitmore folded the page carefully and placed it back into the folder. Silence pressed down on everyone present, thick and uncomfortable, as though the air itself had become aware of what was coming next. Serena Blake shifted in her seat, the confidence she had worn so comfortably only moments earlier beginning to crack around the edges. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses and resumed in a tone that was purely professional, stripped of sentiment. All previously listed assets, he said, are held in trust. A faint exhale escaped Serena's lips. Relief flickered across her face. Trusts were normal. Expected. She leaned forward slightly, already preparing herself for the moment her name would be spoken with formality and finality. But Mr. Whitmore did not pause. The sole beneficiary, he continued, an appointed trustee is Alara Voss. For a fraction of a second, the words seemed not to register. Then the room reacted all at once. Gasps. Murmurs. Sharp intakes of breath. Serena stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound jarring in the stunned quiet. That's not possible, she said, her voice sharp but brittle, as though it might shatter if pushed too far. Caleb changed everything. Everyone knows that. Mr. Whitmore met her gaze calmly. He did, he replied. This is the change. I remained seated. My heart pounded, but my posture did not shift. This was not triumph. It was confirmation. The quiet validation of years lived without recognition, finally spoken aloud. I did not smile. I did not look at Serena. I focused on breathing evenly, steadily, grounding myself in the reality that this moment was real. The room buzzed with disbelief. People glanced between Serena and me, recalibrating narratives they had already written in their minds. Assumptions unraveled quickly when confronted with truth. Serena's voice rose again, sharper now, edged with panic. She spoke rapidly, words tumbling over each other as she listed the years she claimed to have stood beside Caleb. Hospital nights. Appointments. Sacrifices she insisted no one else saw. Her desperation grew louder as her certainty collapsed. Mr. Whitmore waited. He allowed her to exhaust herself, because some realizations cannot be rushed. When she finally paused, breathless and flushed, he spoke again. There is one remaining bequest, he said, opening a smaller envelope with deliberate care. Hope flared in Serena's eyes, bright and reckless. She stepped closer, as though proximity alone could reclaim control. The envelope slid across the table toward her and stopped. Inside was a bank draft. $1. The room inhaled sharply as one. The cruelty was not in the amount. It was in the precision. This was not oversight. It was intention. A line drawn clearly between presence and permanence. Serena stared at the paper, color draining from her face as understanding settled in. This was not punishment born of anger. It was judgment born of clarity. I watched without satisfaction. The moment did not please me. It saddened me, not because I pitted Serena, but because I recognized the cost of illusions held too long. She had mistaken access for entitlement, noise for devotion. She had been given exactly what she was owed. Nothing more. Nothing less. The room fell into uneasy silence. No one rushed to console her. No one defended her. The story they thought they knew had ended, replaced by one they did not yet understand but would never forget. I rose slowly, not because I had been called to do so, but because I knew it was time. The movement drew every eye, not with shock, but with something quieter, respect. I did not adjust my clothes. I did not prepare a speech. I walked forward with measured steps, unhurried. This was not a victory march. It was a closing of a chapter one had finished long ago. Mr. Whitmore handed me the documents. I accepted them with a nod, my fingers brushing the edge of the folder lightly. I did not look at the figures again. Ownership was not the point. Acknowledgement was. When I turned, my eyes met Serena's. Not with triumph. Not with contempt, but with peace. She searched my face for anger. Rage she could fight. Resentment she could challenge. She found none. I didn't plan this, I said quietly, my voice carrying through the room without effort. I survived it. The words were not an attack. They were a boundary. Then I turned and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. No one spoke. The room understood instinctively that this was not an exit. It was a conclusion. Outside, daylight felt unfamiliar, as though the world had shifted while I sat inside that room. Cars passed. Voices carried. Life continued. And for the first time in years, there was no weight pressing against my chest. Inside Whitmore and Hale chambers, Serena lowered herself into the chair she had so confidently claimed earlier. Conversations resumed in hushed fragments, careful and distant. She had not only lost money. She had lost narrative. The story she built her identity on had collapsed, leaving nothing solid beneath her feet. She realized too late that love measured by reward is always provisional. That loyalty without history rarely survives truth. I never looked back. What followed was not triumph, but authorship. I would decide what came next, not in reaction, but in tension. Caleb's name would endure. Not because of spectacle or scandal, but because the woman he underestimated carried his legacy forward with dignity. And that was the quiet truth the will revealed. The loudest love fades, but the one that endures without applause is the only one that lasts. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from, because stories like this remind us that quiet strength always outlives loud betrayal.